Hello everybody and welcome to this My HCPC Standards session, Send to All, Challenges and Opportunities of Social Media. My name is Hugh Conning. I'm a professional liaison consultant for the Health and Care Professions Council, and I'm also a physiotherapy registrant of the HCPC. Did you know that over 4.5 billion people use social media worldwide? Now, today's focus, as the name suggests, is going to be looking at some of the opportunities that social media presents, such as expanding professional networks or boosting patient engagement, whilst also considering some ways in which we might mitigate for some of the challenges, like those difficulties maintaining professional boundaries or ensuring confidentiality and so on. So we know that most registrants use social media responsibly, adhering to our standards and demonstrating best practice. But some of you have questions or concerns, and our goal in today's session is to therefore support, guide, direct, and notify what we think best practice may be in relation to social media use. So let's make a start. So the learning outcomes of today's session are around identifying the standards that relate to the use of social media, understand what opportunities and challenges we may face when using social media, and then also articulating that boundary between freedom of expression and professional responsibility. Please note that we will be using a Slido poll during today's session, so you may want to have your phone open and at the ready, or you can use a spare browser and point it to slido.com. There is also a Q&A function which you may have found. There's a Q&A icon on your screen, and if you want to use it, you can give it a tap. You'll be able to see announcements from my colleagues in the background and also submit any questions that you may have. I'm hoping the session itself will answer many of the questions that you may have, but please do feel free to pop them in the Q&A if your questions aren't answered. Please note we won't be able to answer questions about specific posts or comment on specific cases, but we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can as the session goes along. So do please sit back, relax, watch and engage as we go along. So this is a roadmap of the session. So I'm going to make a brief introduction to the topic, and we'll go on to cover the HCPC standards and guidance related to this area before talking through some case scenarios and then finishing with some top tips and thoughts on how you might begin to apply the standards or continue to apply the standards in your professional and personal life. So what is social media? Social media refers to websites and applications that allow you to create and share content and to interact with other users. This includes, but is not limited to, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, as well as online forums and blogs. And obviously there are new platforms out all the time. I wouldn't be able to list them all here. Now, these platforms share one thing in common. Typically, they will allow users to interact through various forms of digital communication. So that could include text, images, videos, audio, such as voice notes and the like. And registrants tell us that social media can be super useful. And these are just some of the ways that they have articulated how they are using it. So it can be really useful to develop and share skills and knowledge, to help the public to understand what they do, to network and learn with other professionals, and also to raise the profile of the profession. As I said earlier, I am a physiotherapy registrant of the HCPC, and I probably sort of consume social media professionally. Well, I certainly consume it professionally more than I do personally. I barely use it personally, if I'm honest. But I've certainly used it to network with other professionals, to engage with learning topics, to digest research, look up the latest research on things, and also for campaigning on things that are important to me. So why is healthcare professionals' use of social media of interest now to us as regulators, to employers and wider society? Well, partly that is due to the exponential growth and reach. So there are 56.2 million active social media users in the UK, according to this source, which is Statista. And the social media penetration rate in the UK is 82.8%. So this is a percentage of the total population that are using social media, and that compares to a global average of 59.4. So the reach in the UK is significantly higher than the global average. The leading platform by reach is WhatsApp, which is 79%, and the global average time spent per day in 2023 was 151 minutes. So I don't know where your usage compares to that, but according to one study, if we were to assume average lifespan and usage figures from 2016, from which usage has increased significantly, the average person in the UK would spend 3 years on social media by the end of their life course. And this obviously led to a number of headlines, one including that British people will spend longer on social media than in the pub or queuing during their lifetime. I wonder if we'll want that time back by the time we come to the end of our lives. So not many serious conversations about social media these days happen without some sort of reference to freedom of speech or freedom of expression. And I thought it might be really helpful to briefly explain what freedom of expression is and how this might articulate with the standards around social media. So the European Convention on Human Rights stated in Article 10 that everyone has the right to freedom of expression. And this right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. So freedom of expression in the UK is not codified into a single legal document, but made up by the following acts, decisions, and legal frameworks, which you can see on the slide there. So the Human Rights Act 98 is based on the European Convention of Human Rights, and this protects the freedom of expression subject to certain restrictions that are necessary in a democratic society. So these might include issues relating to national security, public safety, and protection of the rights and reputations of others. So that was further supplemented by the Communications Act 2003, by common law and judicial decisions, and the constitutional framework. So we have freedom of speech, which is enshrined in UK law, but freedom of speech can't be said to be an unlimited legal right. The right needs to be balanced by healthcare professionals' need to protect the public and the reputation of the professions that we're all members of. So an example of that is in Standard 9. Standard 9 says you must make sure that your conduct justifies the public trust and confidence in you and your profession. You must be honest about your experience, qualifications, and skills, and you must make sure that any promotional activities that you're involved in are accurate and not likely to mislead. The outworking of this will be explored in a more practical way later on in the session. But think about a situation where an individual believes something strongly that perhaps goes against the dominant opinion and evidence of the day. So something of a kind of silly example, if you like, but imagine if I think that fresh fruit and vegetables are evil and bad for you. So I may go out of my way to avoid eating them whenever I can. I may supplement them with ice cream or licorice or whatever else when I get the chance. Now, the law obviously protects my right to both do, believe, and express that view, no matter how contrary it is to the best evidence and information we have available. However, as a healthcare professional, I am held to a higher standard of accountability. So this view clearly goes against the best evidence available and the majority of authoritative medical and governmental advice. It could be seen as harmful if I were to promote that view in a public sphere without acknowledging that this is my personal opinion and not necessarily backed by the evidence. So there is nothing more public at the moment than social media. As we've already mentioned, the reach is 82.8% and growing. If I were to post my views on social media relative to fresh fruit and vegetables, this could be seen as having the potential to put the public at risk and potentially to harm the reputation of the profession that I represent. And just for balance, in case anyone is concerned, I wanted to post a public health message here that eating fresh fruit and vegetables is obviously good for you. And contrary to what I just implied, I do eat fresh fruit and vegetables as often as I can. So what are the standards that the HCPC is trying to promote and uphold in relation to registrants' social media use? So our standards are intended to give high-level explanation for the expectation of registrants, whilst giving you the freedom to apply them in your context. So standard 1.6 is concerned with challenging discrimination. So services must be available to all service users and or their carers. When you share content on social media, you must do so in a way that doesn't hinder people's access to your services. This means that we all need to be aware of the impact of our personal views, biases and beliefs, and aware of the impact that these may have on people's access to our services. And this would apply whether we're using a personal or a professional social media account. So social media can blur the boundaries between your personal and professional life. Standard 1.9 to 1.12 says we must always communicate with service users in a professional way and that we must maintain professional boundaries at all times. If your employer's policy permits, you might therefore decide to set up a separate professional account for communicating with the public. And if a service user contacts you through a personal account, we recommend that you politely decline friend requests. If you want to follow up any contact you receive in your professional capacity, consider using a professional communication channel, such as your professional email account to do so. It goes without saying we should consider the impact of any content that we share on different audiences when they see the material that we post. And do bear in mind that personal material you intend to share only with friends, family, or a closed group could easily become accessible to a much wider audience. And once uploaded, it may not be possible to delete it or control how widely it is shared. So standard 210 to 212 is about communicating appropriately. It says we must always be polite and respectful to others when communicating in a professional capacity when using social media, as with other forms of communication. So when using social media, we have to think about the accuracy and truth of the content that we share or circulate. We need to check that the information originates from people or organizations that are trustworthy. And we need to be wary of spreading misinformation. Misinformation refers to inaccurate or false information shared online without the intent to cause harm. This could, for example, be inaccurate photos, dates, or news reports. When engaging in online debate, we must ensure that our views are evidence-based and that they are accurate to the best of our knowledge. And on to standard 5.1. So we must treat information about service users as confidential. Now, this is obviously not a new requirement on healthcare professionals, but social media does present unique challenges in this area. So when we post information about another person on social media, it's really important to think about the appropriateness of sharing that information. And if the information could allow a service user to be identified, we obviously must seek correct permissions to post it. Information could include details about a person's personal life, health or circumstances or images related to their care. And this would apply whether we're sharing it to a personal account or a closed account or closed group, if you like, or to a public account. It's really important to remember jigsaw disclosure here, where seemingly innocuous pieces of information, when combined, can reveal an identity or sensitive or confidential details. So there's not always intent, as often isn't intent when breaching confidentiality. It's often accidental, but it's really important to think through how certain details could be used with information that's already in the public space to identify somebody. The standards 9.1 to 9.3 are concerned with making sure our conduct justifies public trust and confidence, and also taking reasonable steps to ensure any promotional activities we're involved with are accurate and not likely to mislead. So this means we need to think carefully about what we share online. Throughout use of social media, we need to make sure that what we share doesn't bring our professional practice or our profession into disrepute. If we use social media to advertise or share information, for example, about a business or service or related to professional practice, we must make sure it is accurate and true by making reasonable checks to verify it. Now, reasonable checks might include checking sources of information, checking dates, and assessing information against professional knowledge. You may choose to include a disclaimer on your profile that your views are your own and that they don't represent the views of your employer or anyone who contracts your services. You should note that historic social media activity can be considered against our standards, even if you weren't a registered professional at the time of that activity. And if it might do, you could take action, for instance, reviewing old posts and removing historic social media posts or accounts that you feel don't meet the standards. And so to some quick myth busters around social media, starting with my favourite. So myth number 1, you cannot say anything these days without someone getting offended. Now, whilst it's true that sensitivity varies and offence can sometimes be taken regardless of intention, it doesn't negate our responsibility to communicate thoughtfully and respectfully, particularly when representing yourself, your organisation, or your profession. Our words and actions can influence patient behaviour, but also trust and professional reputation, and even public health outcomes on a wider scale. So it's not just about avoiding offence, but also about upholding the integrity and trustworthiness of the healthcare professions. So even if you are challenging someone or something that you think is wrong, it's important to do so in the right way. And of course, people are more likely to respond appropriately and to be able to take your feedback on board if you do so, if you do raise it in the right way. The myth number 2, the standards take away my rights to freedom of speech. We've already discussed that freedom of speech is not an unlimited right in the UK. British law protects the right to freedom of expression, subject to certain restrictions that are necessary in a democratic society. And similarly for healthcare professionals, standards place limits on our right to expression where public safety and the reputation of our professions could be put at risk. And I've already mentioned standard 9.1. You must make sure that your conduct justifies the public trust and confidence in you and your profession. And 9.3, you must make sure that any promotional activities you're involved with are accurate and not likely to mislead. Myth number 3, if I post something about public health that goes against popular opinion, it could be seen as misinformation. Now, there is an extent to which this is true in a general sense. People can obviously interpret our communication and our posts in multiple different ways, and something we consider accurate may be considered misleading or even misinformation by others. It would clearly be wrong, however, to imply that everyone who expresses a view about public health, which is contrary to mainstream opinion, is always spreading misinformation. It is, of course, very important to be balanced in how we post. We need to make clear when we're expressing an opinion and where appropriate to acknowledge opposing views. And lastly, myth number 4, healthcare professionals should avoid using social media. The risks are too great. Well, this webinar would have been a lot quicker if that was our line. How to use social media responsibly, just don't. But that's obviously not the line. So social media provides many benefits, many of which you've shared in the Slido. So if you use it in the right way and prudently, we can reap the benefits and manage and mitigate the risks which are associated with it. And in fact, there are also risks of healthcare professionals' voices not being heard in that space, not being able to help guide people through conflicting and sometimes harmful information which is posted online. So it is very much about how we do it. We're now going to cover 3 fictional case scenarios, which, despite their fictional nature, do accurately reflect the type of concerns that are raised with the HCPC. So firstly, we're going to meet Jonty, and Jonty is a biomedical scientist. Unfortunately, he is not on good terms with several members of the team he works in. He's taken to social media to express his frustrations, complaining to friends and family. This has included posting inappropriate comments about his colleagues, and his posts don't attempt to hide who he or his colleagues are and makes direct references to his employer and his place of work. The posts make his frustrations plain, and at times, unfortunately, he uses derogatory and abusive language about his colleagues. His social media profile is publicly available, as are the comments he has made about those at his place of work. In addition, a number of his colleagues have mutual connections with him on social media, so it would be easy for them to access the posts even if they were made on a private account. Now, a colleague, Karen, has seen his posts and responded by approaching him directly. She challenges him and says that she feels the posts are inappropriate and should be taken down. I think what you posted tonight was inappropriate on DuckDuckGoose. I don't agree with what you're saying, and you should have spoken to the team first if you were that unhappy. I'm sorry, just being honest with you. I think it will get you in trouble, and I don't know what you're trying to achieve with it at all. Later that night, Jonty responds by tagging the colleague in his posts and using derogatory language about it. Karen refers the matter to their mutual line manager. Unfortunately, Jonty has since received complaints from some of his service users who've searched his name online and found his posts. Karen is concerned that as a result of the post, she may have lost the trust of his service users. Jonty asserts that this is a personal matter and he has a right to express himself and his feelings, and it's unrelated to their work. However, the manager considers it could be a disciplinary matter and follows this up with an investigation. The manager is also considering referral to the HCPC, which could lead to a fitness to practice investigation. So whatever Jonty's intent was in making his posts, he'll almost certainly not have intended to end up being investigated or potentially referred to the regulator. Now, it's obviously beyond my remit to pass judgment on posts like this. That's not my job. It's not my job to pass judgment on any posts, but I do think this really highlights the importance of thinking before we post, especially when angry and upset, and ensuring that what we post is accurate, polite, and respectful. Let's go on to talk about Bella. So Bella is a physiotherapist working in fracture clinic. she started using Facebook whilst at work. Now, primarily, she's been posting photos of herself and her colleagues on duty in a clinical setting. But in some instances, she's also posted about patient injuries and occasionally shared photos of their x-rays. These posts never show the face of the patient, but there is otherwise no attempt to hide their identity. Several of the posts, unfortunately, contain confidential patient information, despite this not being the primary focus of the images. Typically, this is in the background of the photo, but sometimes it does include their name, date of birth, and other personal details. Her posts are also geotagged, meaning they identify the location in which they were taken, in this instance, the hospital in which she works. She believes she's only sharing these images with friends on social media and doesn't believe that they pose a risk to her patient's confidentiality. However, Bella's privacy settings are set to public, meaning all her posts are publicly available. And even if the settings were private, experience shows us that this is no guarantee for information not getting out. So you can clearly see the hospital department are identified, as well as personal information about the cause of the injury. And in the photo for mobile users, in the photo of the x-ray, unfortunately, is also the name of the patient, date of birth, and NHS number. And this post quickly picks up traction, getting viewed hundreds of times. So eventually, a mutual friend of Bella's, who we'll call Chris, sees one of her posts of an x-ray and believes this might be one of his co-workers. Chris tags the co-worker in a comment asking if the x-ray is his. He unwittingly also forwards on the confidential data contained within the post. The co-worker sees the post of his x-ray and considers it a breach of his confidentiality. His data is publicly available on the internet, and the nature of the injury was something he wanted to keep private, an embarrassing accident at the supermarket. And instead, this has now been seen by a number of his colleagues who've made comments, and he makes a formal complaint to the HCPC. Now, despite no intention on her part to breach confidentiality, the HCPC would be concerned about the inappropriate nature of the posts and the release of confidential patient information. Even in a less obvious case, sometimes residents reveal identity and sensitive information by mistake, such as through jigsaw disclosure, as I've already mentioned, or simple click of the mouse errors. So it's very important to be careful about sharing specific details of a case of a patient on social media or in any other forum. Last week, we're going to talk about Steve. Steve is a dietitian who works for himself. He's been using social media to improve his outreach and engage with groups he wouldn't have traditionally reached through his practice. He posts general information relating to his practice, targeting areas he may think are interesting to his service users. This includes facts and mythbusters relating to nutrition, generalized advice, advertising services, and sharing articles related to new research. He's checked the information in his posts against his professional knowledge and his current knowledge of where the evidence lies. And he also ensures any links he provides to his service users points to reputable sources of information and advice. This is a fantastic way to use his knowledge and expertise to reach a wider audience, to expand his networks, his circle of influence, and also to potentially advertise his services whilst providing useful public health information and potentially useful information to other healthcare professionals as well. So hopefully you found working through those cases interesting and insightful and helpful to unpack some of the concepts and ideas we discussed in the standards. At this point, I'd like to talk about some very practical top tips on the use of social media. So getting social media right is mostly a matter of having a really clear purpose in mind for your posts and a firm idea of who can see what you're sharing. Once those are in place, it's much easier to determine what is professional and perhaps what isn't. So do by all means think about privacy settings, but always think before you post. Assume that what you post could be shared and read by anyone. Remember that privacy settings don't guarantee that something you post will not be publicly visible. Maintain appropriate professional boundaries as you communicate with colleagues, service users or carers on social media, just as you would in any other form of communication. And don't post information which could identify a service user unless you have their permission. Do not post inappropriate or offensive material, even if you feel strongly that you're in the right of it. Take 5 and consider what it is you're going to post. Ask yourself, is it appropriate, professional, or respectful? Or maybe even get someone to read through it before you send it. Whilst the situation can feel urgent, you very rarely need to react immediately on social media. If you're unsure of the wording or the tone of what you're about to send, waiting and seeking advice is always likely to be the wisest course of action. There is a power in overlooking an offence, and you're far less likely to post something rash if you take time to consider what is the best way to respond. So we're coming to the end of our session for today. So hopefully you've found 1 or 2 things of interest, or perhaps learned something new about social media use, standards, or have some ideas about how to continue to live the standards out in practice regarding social media. So I've got some key takeaways for me from this session, and you may have your own, and that's brilliant. So social media brings many opportunities for healthcare professionals, including chances to develop and share skills, knowledge, and support professional network and promote public health. Not to mention those opportunities to promote a business or a service. The standards for conduct, performance and ethics do make clear our expectations of registrants whilst they're using social media, but they are intended to give you enough freedom to decide how to apply them in your given context. So you may be in a role which doesn't require you to use social media professionally at all, or on the contrary, you may be working for yourself, for example, in your own business, where it's an essential part of your job. So it's really important in whatever context we work and whatever context we're using social media to think before we post. We need to work out who might see what we share. And remember, even the strictest privacy settings don't guarantee that posts won't be circulated more widely. And that brings us nearly to the end of our session. So thank you so much for watching and listening, and please do tell us what you thought of the session to help us improve this session and how we support you going forwards. So we do have a few minutes now for questions, and we've had a few pre-submitted questions, and I've taken a few of the ones that I think would be most useful here. So a question that we had was around working in an education service, and this person said, I find a lot of service users request to stay in touch via social media. To date, I've personally refrained from doing that. But is there any clear advice around that, or anything that stipulates you must not do it? So the standards for conduct, performance and ethics state that professionals must use appropriate forms of communication. So this doesn't rule out the use of social media to stay in contact. As already mentioned, we think it's probably best to do so through a professional social media account that's separate from your personal account, as this will help maintain professional boundaries. So if somebody does approach you on your personal account, you may want to consider directing them to a more formal channel of communication, depending on your work contact. So that could be a professional social media account, or it could be your work email address, for example. Now, whatever you choose, we recommend that you also familiarize yourself with your employer's policies, if your employer has one, and make sure that you're in compliance with that also. So another question that we've had sent in was how to be critical of current outdated practices while staying in line with the standards. Now, a sort of outdated practice was mentioned, but I wasn't familiar with it or even what profession the questioner is from. So I'm going to give a general answer to this question, if I may. It is a really good question, and I think it does demonstrate a really useful aspect of social media. So there is a lot of misleading information out there and other information that could be called misinformation. Social media can be used in an engaging and respectful way to talk about the latest research, the latest assessment and treatment approaches, and also to challenge misinformation. But the usual advice would obviously apply. So do think about the accuracy and the truth of the content that you share or circulate. Check that the information that you're sharing originates from people or organizations or studies that are trustworthy. Be wary of spreading misinformation. And when engaging in online debate, ensure that your views are evidence-based and accurate to the best of your knowledge. And if it is only your opinion, then feel free to say so. For what it's worth, I'd also add that you should keep it professional and keep it about the facts of the case. So don't make it personal or get drawn into an argument that probably isn't good for anyone. If we get drawn into arguments online, it makes it much more likely that someone is going to post something that they later come to regret. So another question we've had is around how to audit a digital footprint for adherence to your organization's policy and professional standards, and make recommendations for future professional and personal practice. So I think that the second part of that question is about how do we ensure we're continuing to meet the standards, which hopefully I've addressed. And the first part, so you should familiarize yourself with your organization's policy to begin with, to check that you're in compliance with it. And hopefully you're more familiar with the professional standards in around social media after today's session. As previously mentioned, historic social media activity can and has been considered against our standards. It has been raised in fitness to practice allegations in the past, even when the person wasn't a registered professional at the time of that activity. So if you are concerned about historical posts, it would be prudent, for instance, to review those posts and consider removing them, or even just removing accounts that you feel don't meet the standards, and give yourself a fresh start. So another question that we've had submitted is around how social media use as an individual overlaps with professional identity. The question was, what should I be mindful of? So the questioner says, I'm fairly mindful of what I post on public forums with my name anyway. So hopefully that doesn't imply not being mindful when posting under other names. Now, I'm hoping we've covered off all the main points here anyway, but just to highlight some of the key ones. By all means, you can have a separate personal and professional account, and there's nothing prohibiting you from choosing not to use your registered name as your username, for example. But it's really important to bear in mind that posting anonymously is no guarantee that your identity won't be revealed by another method. So our policy is that you should always follow the standards in whatever guise and forum you're posting in, as it's the right thing to do. And also posting in private groups and under pseudonyms is still no guarantee that your posts won't be shared with a wider group and that you won't be identified later on. And that's the last of the questions that I have. Huge thanks again for attending today, for watching to the very end if you're still there. I hope you found it really helpful. and we do look forward to seeing you again at one of our sessions in the future. Thanks very much.